Imagine ruling the largest country on earth and not being able to speak its language. Picture a throne room in St. Petersburg, draped in gold and candlelight, where the empress who commands millions of Russian souls writes her most private letters in German, dreams in German, and prays, at least initially, to a Protestant God. That empress is Catherine the Great, born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729. And the question her reign forces us to confront is one that cuts through centuries of Russian history like a blade. Why did a country so obsessed with its own identity, its own orthodox faith, its own sacred soil, keep placing foreigners on its throne, in its councils, and at the very center of its power? The answer is not simple. It is not an accident of history, not a series of coincidences, and certainly not a sign of weakness, though Russia's enemies have often framed it that way. It is instead the product of a civilization built at the intersection of competing worlds, a state that was simultaneously terrified of the outside and desperate to absorb it, a political culture that needed foreigners precisely because it could not trust its own aristocracy, and an empire whose sheer geographic scale made cosmopolitanism not a luxury but a survival strategy. To understand why so many Russian rulers were foreign, you have to go back much further than Catherine. You have to go back to the very beginning, to a moment so foundational that Russians still argue about what it means today. In 862 AD, according to the Primary Chronicle, the great medieval record of early Rus history compiled by monks in Kiev, the Slavic and Finnic tribes of the north sent a remarkable invitation. They had been fighting among themselves, unable to agree on governance, unable to stop the bloodshed. And so they allegedly reached across the Baltic and invited a Varangian chieftain named Rurik to come and rule them. The Chronicle records their words as something close to, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come and reign over us." Whether this account is literally true, whether it was embellished by later chroniclers, or whether it represents a political myth constructed to legitimize dynastic power, is a debate that has consumed historians for centuries. But the myth itself is the point. The Rurikid dynasty, which would rule Russian lands for more than 700 years, traced its origins to a foreigner. The founding act of Russian statehood in the dominant medieval narrative was an invitation to an outsider. This is the Varangian question, and it has never fully gone away. In the 18th century, German scholars working in the Russian Imperial Academy of Sciences argued that the Rurik story proved that Slavic peoples were incapable of self-governance, that they needed Germanic leadership to function as a civilization. Russian scholars, most famously Mikhail Lomonosov, erupted in fury. The debate became nationalist, then political, then dangerous. But here's the irony that nobody on either side wanted to acknowledge. The very czars and empresses who were funding this debate, who were commissioning these histories, who were sitting on the throne of Russia while scholars argued about whether Russians could govern themselves, many of those rulers were themselves of German blood. The argument about Rurik was happening inside a court that proved the argument's premise, and everyone involved was pretending not to notice, to understand how Russia arrived at that paradox. You have to follow the Rurikid dynasty through its long and violent evolution. Rurik's descendants ruled Kievan Rus, then survived its catastrophic destruction by the Mongol invasion of 1237 to 1242, when Batu Khan's forces burned city after city from Ryazan to Kiev, killing perhaps half the population of some regions. The Mongol yoke, as Russians would later call it, lasted roughly 2.5 centuries. And during those centuries, something profound happened to Russian political culture. The princes who survived did so by learning to navigate a foreign imperial system, by paying tribute to the Golden Horde, by traveling to Sarai on the Volga to receive their patents of authority from Mongol Khans. They absorbed administrative techniques, postal systems, taxation methods, and above all, a particular model of sovereign power, absolute, vertical, and legitimized by force rather than consensus. When historians debate why Russian autocracy became so extreme compared to Western European monarchies, the Mongol period is always part of the answer. Russia's rulers had learned statecraft from conquerors, and that lesson never fully faded. The Rurikid line finally collapsed in chaos. Tsar Fyodor I, the last Rurikid, died in 1598 without an heir, and Russia plunged into the time of troubles, a decade and a half of civil war, famine, foreign invasion, and social collapse so severe that the population of some regions fell by 1/3. Polish forces actually occupied Moscow and sat in the Kremlin. A Polish prince, Władysław IV, was briefly elected Tsar by a faction of Russian boyars who preferred him to the chaos around them. He never took the throne, but the fact that Russian nobles seriously considered placing a Catholic Polish prince on the Orthodox Russian throne tells you something crucial about the relationship between legitimacy and pragmatism in Russian political thought. When the state was failing, when the alternative was anarchy, foreign origin mattered less than the ability to impose order. The Romanov dynasty that emerged from the time of troubles in 1613 was Russian by any reasonable definition. Michael Romanov was 16 years old, politically unthreatening, and connected to the old Rurikid line through his great-aunt Anastasia, the first wife of Ivan the Terrible. But the Romanovs were about to do something that would permanently alter the genetic and cultural composition of the Russian ruling class. They were going to marry into Europe, systematically and deliberately, until the Russian imperial family became one of the most thoroughly German dynasties in the world, while continuing to insist on its Russian Orthodox identity. The process accelerated under Peter the Great, and this is where the story becomes truly extraordinary. Peter, born in 1672, was as Russian as any Tsar had ever been. Raised in the wooden palaces of Moscow, shaped by the culture of the Streltsy and the Boyars, haunted by the violence he had witnessed during the Streltsy Revolt of 1682, when as a 10-year-old boy he watched his relatives hacked to pieces in front of him. That trauma, many historians argue, never left him. But Peter's response to Russian backwardness was not to retreat into tradition. It was to import the world. He traveled to Western Europe in 1697 and 1698, working incognito in Dutch shipyards, studying anatomy in Amsterdam, visiting factories and arsenals and courts. He came back and began the most violent modernization program in Russian history, forcing his boyars to shave their beards, imposing Western dress, building a new capital on a swamp at the mouth of the Neva River that would cost tens of thousands of lives in its construction and would be named in Dutch-inflected style Sankt Peterburg. And crucially, Peter imported people, German engineers, Dutch shipwrights, Scottish officers, Swedish administrators captured during the Great Northern War and offered positions rather than prison. He created the Table of Ranks in 1722, a bureaucratic system that theoretically allowed anyone, including foreigners, to rise through state service regardless of birth. The message was explicit: competence mattered more than origin. What Peter was doing was not simply modernizing Russia. He was restructuring the relationship between the Russian state and the concept of Russian identity, deliberately decoupling them. You could serve Russia, you could be useful to Russia without being ethnically Russian. This was a revolutionary idea, and it had consequences that Peter himself could not have foreseen. One of those consequences arrived almost immediately after his death. Peter died in 1725 without clearly naming a successor, and Russia entered a period sometimes called the era of palace revolutions, nearly 4 decades during which the Russian throne changed hands 6 times, often through coups engineered by the imperial guards. What is remarkable about this period is not just the instability, but the profile of the rulers it produced. Anna of Courland, who reigned from 1730 to 1740, was a German duchess, the niece of Peter the Great, who had spent most of her adult life outside Russia and surrounded herself with Baltic German advisors, most notoriously Ernst Johann von Biron, whose influence over Russian court politics was so total that the period is sometimes called the Bironovshchina, the time of Biron. Russian nobles seethed. They wrote petitions, they whispered in corridors, they resented the foreigners who seemed to be eating Russia from the inside. But they also could not agree on an alternative, and their inability to unite against Biron was itself a product of the political culture Peter had created, one in which the state apparatus was too powerful and too centralized for any faction to challenge without risking everything. Then came Elizabeth, Peter's daughter, who seized the throne in a coup in 1741 and made a point of her Russian identity, her Orthodox piety, her love of Russian culture. Elizabeth was genuinely Russian in her sensibilities, and her reign saw a flowering of Russian cultural confidence. But even Elizabeth could not escape the dynastic logic of European marriage politics. She needed an heir, and she chose her nephew, Karl Peter Ulrich of Holstein-Gottorp, who became Peter III. He was German. He spoke Russian poorly. He admired Frederick the Great of Prussia so extravagantly that he reversed Russia's entire foreign policy in the middle of the 7 Years' War, withdrawing Russian forces from a conflict they were winning, handing Frederick a miraculous escape that the Prussian king himself called a miracle of the House of Brandenburg. Russian officers who had bled for years in that war were furious. The Guards regiments were furious. And Peter III's wife, a German princess who had arrived in Russia at 14 years old and had spent the intervening years learning Russian, studying Orthodoxy, and making herself indispensable to every faction at court, was watching and waiting. Catherine, born Sophie Friederike August von Anhalt-Zerbst, executed one of the most successful political transformations in the history of monarchy. She arrived in Russia in 1744 as a minor German princess, with no money, no powerful family connections, and no guarantee of surviving the treacherous politics of the Russian court. She had everything to lose and almost nothing to offer, except her intelligence, her adaptability, and her absolute determination to survive. She converted to Orthodoxy with what contemporaries described as genuine conviction, though skeptics have always questioned how genuine any conversion can be when it is the price of survival. She learned Russian so thoroughly that she wrote and spoke it fluently, though she continued to think and correspond in French and German. She read Voltaire, Montesquieu, and the encyclopedists, and she genuinely engaged with Enlightenment ideas, not just as fashion, but as a framework for thinking about governance. When Peter III was overthrown and killed in July 1762, Catherine's role in his death remains disputed. But her role in the coup that deposed him is not. She became Empress of Russia with a claim to the throne that was, by any strict legal standard, essentially non-existent. She was not Romanov by blood, she was not even Russian. Her right to rule rested entirely on the support of the Guards regiments, the acquiescence of the Senate, and her own political skill. And yet she would reign for 34 years, longer than almost any other Russian ruler, and she would expand the empire by more than 200,000 square miles, defeat the Ottoman Empire twice, partition Poland 3 times, and preside over a cultural flourishing that produced some of the greatest institutions in Russian history, including the Hermitage Museum and the Russian Academy of Sciences. How did a German woman with no legitimate claim become the greatest of Russian empresses? This is the question that gets to the heart of what we are really talking about when we ask why Russian rulers were foreign, because Catherine's success was not despite her foreignness. In certain specific and important ways, it was because of it. She had no clan, no extended family network, no ancestral enemies among the Russian nobility. She was not entangled in the feuds and alliances that had paralyzed Russian politics for generations. She could choose her favorites, and she chose many based on their usefulness to her rather than on inherited obligations. She could look at Russian institutions with a degree of detachment that native-born rulers often could not manage, seeing them as systems to be reformed rather than traditions to be venerated. And she understood with the clarity of an outsider who had worked very hard to become an insider that the performance of Russian identity was in some ways more important than its substance. She built Orthodox churches. She patronized Russian composers and artists. She corresponded with the philosophies but governed like an autocrat. She knew exactly what Russia needed to see in its ruler, and she provided it. But Catherine's reign also crystallized something troubling, something that the German question at the Russian court had been building toward for decades. The Baltic German nobility, Lutheran, educated, administratively skilled, had become indispensable to the Russian imperial system. They staffed the officer corps, the civil service, the diplomatic corps. Families like the Bennigsen, the Barclay de Tolly, the Wrangel, the Palin, these were not Russian names, but they were Russian servants, and in some cases Russian heroes. Mikhail Barclay de Tolly, of Scottish descent through the Baltic German nobility, commanded Russian forces in the opening phase of the 1812 war against Napoleon, implementing the controversial strategic retreat that drove Napoleon deeper into Russia while preserving the Russian army. He was despised by much of the Russian public, who saw a foreign-sounding general abandoning Russian soil to a foreign invader. The Tsar replaced him with Mikhail Kutuzov, who was Russian, who was beloved, and who continued essentially the same strategy. The strategy worked. Napoleon was destroyed, but the credit went to the Russian name, not the foreign one, and Barclay de Tolly spent years fighting for recognition that was only partially granted during his lifetime. This pattern, foreign talent doing the work, Russian identity getting the credit, or alternatively foreign origin being used to explain failure, runs through Russian imperial history like a fault line. It was not unique to Russia. Every major European empire used cosmopolitan elites to manage its complexity. The Habsburg Empire was the supreme example, a multi-ethnic bureaucracy held together by loyalty to a dynasty rather than to any single nation. The British Empire drew on Scottish, Irish, and Welsh administrators, soldiers and engineers to run an enterprise that called itself English. But Russia's relationship with this cosmopolitanism was uniquely tortured because Russia's self-image was so specifically ethnic and religious. The Orthodox faith, the Slavic language, the sense of a chosen people with a sacred mission. These were not compatible, at least in theory, with a ruling class that prayed in German and corresponded in French. The tension between the imperial reality and the national mythology was always there, always dangerous, always waiting to be weaponized. It was weaponized with particular ferocity in the 19th century as Romantic nationalism swept through Europe and Russian intellectuals began to grapple seriously with the question of what Russia actually was. The Slavophiles argued that Russia had a unique spiritual mission rooted in Orthodox Christianity and communal peasant life, that Peter the Great's westernization had been a catastrophic mistake, that the German-dominated court was a corruption of Russia's true nature. The westernizers argued that Russia needed to continue integrating with European civilization, that the reforms of Peter and Catherine had been necessary and beneficial. Both sides were arguing in different registers about the same underlying problem: a state whose ruling class was culturally alien to the people it ruled, and a people whose authentic culture had been systematically marginalized by that ruling class. The Slavophile critique had real force, and not just as nationalism. There was something genuinely strange about a country where the aristocracy spoke French among themselves, where Russian was considered the language of servants and peasants, where a noble family that spoke Russian at home might be looked at with mild condescension in St. Petersburg drawing rooms. Pushkin, the greatest Russian poet, was descended from an African slave brought to Russia by Peter the Great, his great-grandfather Abram Hannibal. Pushkin wrote in Russian, created Russian literature in a sense that no one had before him, and was himself a product of the imperial cosmopolitanism. He sometimes celebrated and sometimes resented. His death in a duel in 1837 was mourned as a national tragedy, but the man who killed him, Georges Charles de Hicqueren-D'Anthès, was a French-born officer who had been adopted by the Dutch ambassador to Russia and who had made a career in Russian imperial service. The tragedy of Pushkin's death became, in Russian cultural memory, a story about foreigners destroying Russian genius. The reality was considerably more complicated, involving personal honor, sexual jealousy, and court intrigue that transcended any simple national narrative. By the late 19th century, the Romanov dynasty was facing a crisis that its cosmopolitan origins had helped create. The family was, by blood, almost entirely German. Nicholas II, who would be the last Tsar, was the great-great-grandson of Catherine the Great on his father's side and had German ancestry from virtually every other direction as well. His wife Alexandra was born Alex of Hesse-Darmstadt, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. She spoke Russian with a heavy accent for much of her life, was deeply uncomfortable with the performative sociability that Russian court life demanded, and retreated into a private religious world that eventually brought Grigory Rasputin into the center of imperial power. Rasputin, a Siberian peasant mystic with genuine charisma and apparent ability to ease the hemophilia of the Tsarevich Alexei, was in one sense the most Russian figure imaginable, a rough, uneducated man from the Siberian steppe who claimed a direct spiritual connection to God. But his influence over the German-born empress and through her over the Tsar became, in the fevered atmosphere of World War I, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the Romanov court. Rumors spread, many of them false, some of them deliberately manufactured, that Alexandra and Rasputin were German agents, that the Empress was betraying Russia to her homeland. The xenophobia that had always lurked beneath the surface of Russian imperial culture erupted with full force. The irony is devastating. A dynasty that had spent 2 centuries importing German brides and German administrators was now being destroyed in part by anti-German hysteria, by the very nationalism that its cosmopolitan model of empire had always struggled to contain. Nicholas II renamed St. Petersburg to Petrograd in 1914 because the original name sounded too German. He could not rename his wife, his children, or the fundamental structure of a state that had been built on the idea that the best talent should be recruited wherever it could be found. The February Revolution of 1917 swept away the Romanovs. The October Revolution swept away the entire imperial order, and the Bolsheviks who came to power promised something utterly different, a state based not on dynasty, not on ethnicity, not on religion, but on class. But here too, the question of foreign origin did not disappear. It simply transformed. Lenin had German, Swedish, and Kalmyk ancestry. Trotsky was Jewish, and in the vicious anti-Semitism of the Civil War period, his Jewish origin was used by his enemies to paint the entire Bolshevik leadership as foreign, as alien, as un-Russian. Stalin, who ultimately destroyed Trotsky and everyone associated with him, was Georgian, not Russian at all, born in the small town of Gori in 1878, speaking Russian with a Georgian accent for his entire life. The man who would build the most extreme version of Russian state power in history, who would industrialize the country at the cost of millions of lives, who would defeat Nazi Germany and emerge as one of the most powerful figures of the 20th century, was himself a foreigner in the country he controlled with absolute terror. Stalin understood Russian political culture with the clarity of an outsider who had studied it obsessively, who had made himself indispensable to it, who had learned to weaponize its paranoia and its appetite for strong leadership. In this sense, he was the Soviet Catherine the Great, a foreigner who became more Russian than the Russians, or at least more effective at wielding Russian state power than any native-born alternative. The pattern, when you step back and look at it across 1,000 years, is not really about foreigners at all. It is about the structural logic of a particular kind of state. Russia, from Rurik to Stalin, was a state that demanded absolute loyalty to the ruler rather than to any ethnic or cultural community. It was a state where the danger of internal factions, of aristocratic coalitions, of regional separatism was always greater than the danger of an individual outsider. A foreigner at the top of the system had no clan to favor, no ancestral rivals to punish, no local loyalties to compromise his service to the state. He or she was dependent entirely on the ruler's favor, which made him useful precisely because he was vulnerable. Peter the Great understood this, Catherine understood this. Stalin, in his own monstrous way, understood this too, which is why he systematically destroyed every independent power base in Soviet society, reducing everyone around him to the same condition of absolute dependence that had historically made foreigners useful. Geography played its role as well. Russia's position at the intersection of Europe and Asia, its vast borderlands inhabited by dozens of distinct peoples, its need to administer territories that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, all of this made ethnic homogeneity in the ruling class not just impractical but actively counterproductive. You needed people who could speak to the Tatars of Kazan, the Cossacks of the Don, the Germans of the Baltic provinces, the Poles of the western borderlands, the Georgians of the Caucasus. The Russian imperial state was, in practice, a multi-ethnic enterprise long before any European state formally acknowledged the concept of multi-ethnicity. It absorbed peoples and used them, sometimes brutally, sometimes with considerable sophistication, always instrumentally. And yet the myth of ethnic Russian purity at the center of power persisted, because it had to. The legitimacy of the Russian state rested in part on its claim to represent a particular people with a particular faith and a particular destiny. The Orthodox Church provided the theological scaffolding for this claim, the idea of Moscow as the third Rome, the successor to Byzantium, the guardian of true Christianity after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. This was a powerful idea, and it required Russian rulers to perform Russianness even when they did not embody it. Catherine attended Orthodox services with conspicuous devotion. Nicholas II cultivated an image of simple Russian piety that was at odds with the cosmopolitan reality of his court. Stalin rehabilitated Russian nationalism during World War II, invoking Alexander Nevsky and Suvorov and the memory of 1812, because he understood that class consciousness was not sufficient to motivate men to die in the snow outside Moscow. You needed something older, something deeper, something that felt like blood and soil and sacred obligation. The legacy of all this is still with us, still contested, still unresolved. Modern Russia continues to wrestle with the question of what Russian identity actually means. Who belongs to it? Who can claim it? Who can be excluded from it? The Rurikid myth, the Varangian question, the memory of Catherine, and the Baltic Germans, and the Romanov dynasty's German blood, these are not merely historical curiosities. They are the foundations of a political culture that has always been simultaneously open to outside talent and deeply suspicious of outside influence, that has always needed the world and resented needing it, that has always been ruled by people who understood power better than they understood the people they ruled. The great rulers of Russia, and there were great ones, whatever else they were, understood something that their critics never quite grasped. Russia was not a nation in the Western European sense. It was an empire, a project, a continuous act of political will imposed on an almost incomprehensible geographic and human diversity. Running that project required pragmatism above all else. It required the ability to find talent wherever it existed, to use people regardless of their origin, to subordinate every other consideration to the maintenance of state power. Foreigners were useful not in spite of their foreignness, but because of it. They were free of the entanglements that made native-born elites dangerous. They were motivated by gratitude and ambition rather than by ancestral claim. They were in the cold calculus of autocratic power, more controllable. What this tells us about Russia is not that it was weak or confused or incapable of self-governance. It tells us that it was a particular kind of state, one that solved the problems of scale and diversity through a model of power that was cosmopolitan at the top and nationalist in its mythology, inclusive in its recruitment and exclusive in its identity, open to the world and terrified of it simultaneously. That contradiction is not a flaw in Russian history. It is Russian history, and it did not end with the Romanovs, or with Stalin, or with the Soviet Union. It simply found new forms, new names, new justifications. The question of who truly belongs at the center of Russian power and what that belonging actually requires has never been fully answered. It may be the oldest open question in Russian political life, and it is still being asked today.